Hello, boys and girls, and welcome again to another series of I Didn't Know That About Wyoming. I'm Mr. Dennis.
I'm Tatum. I'm Cammy.
And we wish you a great big Yahoo! All right, as we bring you the last of the series of the American Cowboys. Today we kind of take you from the large open range down to how we become down to closed range with many of the ranchers and farmers today blocking off their property with fences and closing down the livelihood of the large barren cattlemen who once owned and occupied most of the great grasslands of Wyoming with large herds of cattle. As Wyoming grew and homesteaders began to come into the area, hoping to find a livelihood of being able to live off the land, or as in the mid-1800s sheep were introduced into the state of Wyoming, there began to be conflicts between the sheepmen and the cattlemen. So great was this conflict that in 1866 the cattle barons gathered together and decided that they would get rid of the sheepmen and the homesteaders that were occupying their land. In so doing, they contracted with Texas Rangers from Texas to come up, and they actually had a list of bounties of individuals that they wanted these Texas Rangers to murder. One of these individuals was a man by the name of Nate Champion. Nate Champion lived not too far from the KC Ranch, just north of Buffalo, Wyoming, and he and his partners was in a cabin one day, and as he went out to get water early in the morning, he was gunned down by the Texas Rangers. This caused so much fury amongst the homesteaders and the sheepmen that they gathered together into the barn that you see here, and they began to put up arms against the cattlemen. Well, as the story goes, the cattlemen brought in these Texas Rangers as well as many of their cowhands, and a battle pursued for 3 days in which there was gunfire coming from both sides. The interesting thing is other than a few of the men getting wounded and then dying from their wounds, very few were actually shot. But the cattlemen came up with a plan where they took 2 wagons, they put them together, and they put boards around the wagons, and they began to use those as kind of a battering ram and a protection. They would get behind the boards that they had built around the wagon and began to push this wagon with fire down towards this barn with the hopes of being able to burn out the homesteaders and the sheepmen that were inside. Well, just like an old Western story, they had everything ready to go. They were about ready to light the torch when in came the U.S. cavalry and stopped them from being able to proceed with their plans. The U.S. Army arrested originally the Texas Rangers for having murdered some of the cattlemen and ranchmen, but the governor of Wyoming released the Texas Rangers and allowed them to go back to Texas. But this particular incident pretty much brought an end, although there were some conflicts that continued. The major conflict between the cattlemen and the ranchmen and the homesteaders began to come to an end. The large cattle barons with the wide open spaces of thousands of acres of land no longer existed. Now we began to see smaller and smaller ranchers and farmers coming into play. In fact, they began to introduce to Wyoming barbed wire. Mr. Dennis has some examples of some of the types of early barbed wires that they used. This particular one is called a ryle barb. Remember our spurs that had those little riles on them? Well, this is why it was called a ryle barb. And you can see that it spins around, the idea being that it would spin so that it wouldn't hurt the cattle too much that we're trying to get through. But oftentimes these things would get caught, and then they became very dangerous to the cattle or livestock that would try to break through the fence. This next one is called a Decker spread. It came about in about 1884. This, on the other hand, was along with the one down below called the Frank spur. These three became widely used for the real purpose of causing harm to any animal who tried to get through. And of course, that's why we don't see a lot of these types of barbed wires used today, because these barbed wires would be very harmful to livestock that happen to break through and come through a wire. One of the oldest pieces of wire that Mr. Dennis has is this single piece right here. This is actually called a planter's wire, and it was developed in the 1700s just as a means of bordering around a location or your property. A unique piece is this piece here called the ornamental barb. You see how the wire is twisted, and then again we have another piece of one of these 2-point ribs. Very sharp and very dangerous piece of wire that was used by some of the early ranchers to keep away the cattle out of their property, which was so prevalent by the early barons. This is another collection of different types of barbed wires. The diamond barb in the shape of a diamond, and then the single strand barb with a single wire that just has barb going across. The piece in the middle here is more unique to the type of barbed wire that we use today. So just as these early small ranchers and homesteaders begun to build fences in these open ranges to keep cattle out of the property that they were living in, we do the same thing today. And in addition to that, we want to make sure that our cattle are identified from others. And so if the three of us were different ranchers, but we all lived close to one another, sometimes our cattle would come together, break through the barbed wire, and maybe mingle one with another. So Cammie, how would we ever tell them apart?
Well, you would use brand marks. Like, these.
All right. Yeah, we would use brands. And it's interesting as we conclude our history of the American Cowboy today. I want to end with talking a little bit about how brands were read. So, Tatum, can you tell us one way in which we might be able to read a brand?
If it's kind of shaped like an E, it's reverse.
It would just be an E, right?
Yeah, it's just gonna be.
But wonder if we turn it backwards, then it's a...
Be a reverse
Yeah.
E.
Yeah. Wonder if we laid it down.
It would be a duck
What do we do when we lay down?
sleep.
Yeah, so this would be a sleeping E. This would be a reverse E. And then this would be a simple E. So brands can sleep. Brands can be reversed. Cammie, how else might we use a brand? Take the one that you have there.
This one is a lazy Z.
Because it's laying down.
Laying down, and then an R.
All right, so let me ask you a question, Cammie. How do we know that this would be a lazy ZR rather than
W.
a W or a upside down R? How do we read brands? Brands are always read
read
from...
them from left to right.
Yeah, brands are always read from left to right, just like we do a book. So we would know that this would be a lazy ZR. Now, and you have another brand there, Cammie. Let me hold that one. And you can take this one. What would that brand be?
This one is a V.
V. But, wonder if you put it upside down.
A.
It would be a
Up V.
upside down V. Or sometimes referred to as a crazy V. Now, let me take that V. You hold it up there for me, Cammie. And I'm going to ask you and Tatum to help me out here. We have a crazy V, but wonder if I was to put a half moon under here, like a rocker. Then it would be called a
rocking V.
A rocking V. You're absolutely right. Now, Tatum, pay attention to this one. Wonder if I was to take this same V, except I was to put little sides on it, kind of like a wings. It would be a...
Walking V.
What would you do with wings?
Oh, flying.
A flying V. Yeah. So, brands can fly, brands can rock. In fact, if I take your E here, hold that up, and if I put like little feet on it, this would be a walking E. So we could have brands that actually walk. All right. Now, let me ask you one more about brands. Wonder if we had a brand in, let me see, how could I do this? So we have a rocking brand, a flying brand. If I actually took this V and there was a squiggly line through the middle of it, do you know what that brand would be doing?
Running V? No.
Well, you'd think a running V, but it would be called a swimming V. Yeah, so lots of different types of brands were used, and brands could do a lot of different things. So next time you're out driving around Wyoming and you happen to see a herd of cattle, look closely and see if you can see what brand they have, and maybe see if you can name it. Again, boys and girls, we thank you for being with us today as we conclude this session of the American Cowboy.